conversation recently with a Christian about the Bible, and it really got me thinking about the concept of a sacred text and what that means and what that can mean for somebody who maybe has a spirituality or a religion that does not include a didactic sacred text like the Bible or the Quran or any other kind of, official text of that religious tradition. And I feel like in the alternative spiritual community, we have quite a lot of different texts that we do engage with. And to be honest, to an extent, I think our practices, they are kind of based on specific texts, maybe more than we always realize or think about in the moment. Like, for example, the way that we do ritual is really based on quite a specific way of doing kind of ceremonial magic, of casting a circle. And even for those of us who don't officially kind of cast circles, I feel like our idea of what ritual looks like tends to be very based on a very Wiccan kind of interpretation of creating sacred space and creating a kind of a magical space, whether we're kind of working magic or not. But in general, I feel like I don't really have a specific text or a group of texts that I think of as being my go-to sacred texts when it comes to having questions or issues or concerns or things that I want to think about in terms of my spiritual beliefs or in terms of integrating my spirituality into my day-to-day life. Because I feel like that's kind of how texts like the Bible operate. They give the person, the believer, they give them this kind of sounding board, this place to keep coming back to and to keep interpreting and reading and questioning in order to kind of bring their religious tradition into their everyday lives and to kind of interpret their life and their progression as an individual in the context of this specific book. So I do have books that I reach for more often than others, and I do have them here on the table beside me, and I might actually go through some of them and talk about them a little bit in this video as well, but I don't necessarily think of them as being sacred texts. Like, they are books that were particularly inspiring to me. Some of them maybe helped me develop my actual practice and develop my Wheel of the Year, my concept of the Wheel of the Year, my celebrations in the year. They helped me develop my concept of what creating sacred space looks like and what I might do when I sit down to celebrate spiritually, when I sit down to do ritual. Most of them are more kind of inspirational in the way that I think. In the way that I think about the world, in my worldview, and in just shaking up a worldview that I felt was quite stagnant. And that's the way that most of them kind of inform my life. I feel like I turn to them when I need to remember why I choose to be spiritual, and when I just need that kind of sense of reverence and wonder and so on. And when I'm just feeling a little bit out of touch with that kind of discourse. And maybe it's the same for people who do kind of do Bible study or similar with whatever other kind of religious texts that they may be operating with. Maybe it's a kind of a similar thing that maybe people feel like if they move away from the Bible, if they don't read the Bible for a while, that they kind of lose touch with the sense of just that kind of discourse that they associate with their religion. But something I feel like I really don't have is a text that I can maybe consider to be specially sacred. A text that I can develop a relationship with over a long period of time, over maybe the course of my entire life, that I kind of hold a special association with regards to my spirituality, that I can use to maybe answer questions that I might have about the world and to give me guidance in terms of, where to go with my spirituality, what direction I should be going with my practice, and how I should answer any questions, any difficulties that arise in my life. I definitely don't have any single book or even a collection of books that will necessarily do that for me. And the reason that I don't have this, and the reason why many of you don't have this, is quite simple. It's because many of us have rejected a traditional religious practice, a traditional religious institution that we were raised in, or we have just rejected all of the traditional religions that are kind of available to us in our cultural context. And we have set out to develop something that we see as being an alternative. It's kind of in the name, alternative spirituality, which I feel is kind of the rubric that kind of subsumes us, me, and probably most of my viewers, anyone who is kind of in the pagan-y, witchy sort of community. We consider ourselves to be an alternative spirituality because we have decided that no, we don't want to be part of these kind of large religious institutions that are surrounding us, but also we don't want to be part of the kind of what I think of as the kind of religious institution of science, that we don't want to just kind of fall into that dogma of scientism where people believe that science has answered everything and that in order to be scientific you need to be an atheist. So we have rejected all of that and we have decided that we want something different, that we want to celebrate and hold a different kind of worldview and to kind of keep exploring. And questioning and rejecting authority really comes with the territory. I think it can be dangerous to assume that we are managing to reject authority completely, because that's impossible. We exist in a social context and we are being influenced all the time by so many different types of authority in our lives, whether it's spiritual or not. And I think that no matter what path you're going down, you're always kind of being inspired and being influenced by various different types of authorities, even if it's just a YouTuber that you watch or a book that you've read on paganism or spirituality or Wicca or whatever. Those are all forms of authority and we are informed by them. But definitely in the alternative spiritual kind of community, there is this sense of a rejection of any one person or any one book giving us the final answer. So it kind of makes sense that we don't tend to have a one book or a one text, or one sacred text that gives us all the answers. And so that's why I don't have a book like that. Like, it's never seemed to me in my progression to this point to be something that I'm actually looking for. I've never been looking to drop anchor at one specific text, at one specific answer. I don't feel like I've ever been, ever since I went through my phase of atheism as a teenager and then came out the other end of that looking for something more, I don't feel like I've actually ever been looking for one person or one authority that was going to give me the final answer. Maybe because I'd already gone through that stage of really questioning religious authority and feeling like coming to the conclusion that I was not Christian because I just didn't buy into that. So I wasn't going to necessarily think that any other person had all the answers, because I didn't feel like I could see any evidence in the world that would, verify that one specific person's understanding of deity, of divinity, was correct. So there's never been a point in my life when that's been something that I'm looking for, when I'm looking to just go out there and find one person, one text, one authority that was going to give me all the answers, and that was going to be just one body of work that I could keep coming back to in order to answer all my questions. But having said all of that, having that conversation with that person who, he studies the Bible every day, he has done so, or almost every day, on a very regular basis. He has done so for most of his life. He keeps coming back to the Bible repeatedly throughout his life and has developed quite a relationship with it, and it's a very strong part of his exploration of his religiosity and of his relationship to divinity. I just started to see for the first time really the value in that, and it's actually not something that I had as a child either. I was raised roughly Catholic, kind of vaguely Catholic, loosely Catholic, but relating to the Bible wasn't actually a big part of my education. I'm not particularly well versed in the Bible. Probably most of what I know about the Bible I have picked up since coming here to Edinburgh and being surrounded by biblical scholars and Christians and people who do know a lot about the Bible. Even within religious studies, a lot of people just are well versed in religion in general, so they actually know quite a lot about the Bible, and I've probably learned more from that than I actually did from my upbringing, ironically enough. But I'd never really been exposed to this idea of having such a strong relationship to one text and really mining one particular text for kind of all the answers. So through that conversation, obviously I try to explain to him that, you know, I am spiritual. I do consider myself to be in some way religious. Like I'm not religious in a way that a lot of people would recognize as being religious, but I consider myself to be religious. And the conversation that we ended up having around that, he started talking about, we were kind of clarifying back and forth what we meant by a sacred text, and he was explaining that in his religion, Jesus is truth, and the Bible is not necessarily in itself truth, that it is true for him, but that the Bible is kind of sharing the word of Christ, I suppose is what it's doing, but it's kind of this intermediary between Jesus and the person reading it and the people kind of experiencing the word of God through this text. So he's kind of acknowledging that it's been written by humans, and it's trying to express the truth that was Jesus Christ. I found that very interesting because I kind of said to him, well, I could, you know, through that understanding of how the Bible then relates you to divinity, I could understand any book to be sacred in that sense, because as a pantheist, any human who has existed has experienced divinity. You know, they've experienced divine reality, and so them expressing their experiences, them expressing the human experience and expressing anything with any kind of depth of emotion and just really anything that's going to expand my mind and my understanding of the world through another human's perspective, is a version of me experiencing truth or divine truth through another person. Because to me, all of reality is divinity, and our entire experience of this life is divine, if that makes sense. Like everything that we experience is part of this divine cosmos, right? So every time that we want to try and express something through communicating to another person, whatever way that is, whether it's through writing or speech or whatever, and we are expressing a different facet of divinity to that person that they may not be experiencing themselves. So they are getting to experience a different part of divine truth through being handed this experience of another person, and through being communicated this other experience that they have not and cannot have, because, you know, our experiences are limited. We are limited to our own minds and to our own context, and you know, there's only so much that we can see and experience through the bodies and the brains that we have in this life. And it kind of really made me think about how much I value my interactions with other humans, how I see that as being sacred, how, you know, every meaningful interaction I have with another human, with another being, or just at all in life, actually, to me is absolutely holy and sacred, and the best way for me to experience and revere the divine is through having as many kind of different experiences I possibly can, and interacting with as many different minds, as many different people as I can in this life, in order to kind of expand my consciousness, expand my understanding of what it is to be alive and what it is to be to exist in this reality, right? So it really made me think, well, in that case, I could choose to have any text that is really particularly profound to me, that really makes me feel something, or that I have gotten value out of in my life, and I could decide to treat that book as being my sacred text. And it's kind of overwhelming to imagine, because any one text kind of almost doesn't feel like it could possibly be rich enough to be kind of the text that I turn to in order to receive all of my answers. But the thing about, you know, being a bit of a spiritual maverick is that, of course, any one text isn't going to answer everything for you. You know, you're not going to kind of put all of your faith and all of your decision making and everything that you decide morally and, you know, in your life, you're not going to put all of that into the hands of one author and decide that every single choice and decision that you make in your life has to be, you know, based on the answers that this one book gives you. But I definitely am starting to feel like there is probably value in really delving into a specific text or specific texts through a really, really close reading and a really, really close understanding of the text, in order to kind of I suppose it's actually quite similar to using tarot, right? Like that the more you kind of delve into the content of a book, and you could, so a specific paragraph or even a specific sentence or a specific phrase can be understood in so many different ways. And you can go so far beyond authorial intent, I think, with a text. You can understand those words on so many different levels. And a really, really good book, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, or I think particularly fiction and poetry might be actually particularly good for this, but you can probably do it with any kind of book at all. Maybe kind of mythology and fairy tales might be particularly good in this way because they're so replete with symbolism and metaphor. But I feel like any book like that, especially one that you really love and that you really get something out of, that you really click with and vibe with, that really makes you feel things, I feel like you can definitely go to that book and seek inspiration and wisdom from it, because all that you're doing really is mining your own understanding of the world, the depths of your own consciousness, through seeing it mirrored in how you read a text. But also you are going beyond that because you are gaining insight into someone else's experience, someone else's interpretation of reality. So you're kind of getting the two things, that you're managing to delve into yourself, but also into the mind of another person. And it seems to me like it could be a really, really valuable enterprise. So I'm kind of coming away from these thoughts with a couple of different conclusions. I mean, first of all, I feel like to an extent tarot can be my sacred text. And I think for a lot of us in this community, any of us who read tarot, I think that's what tarot is for us. I think that a lot of the time, especially for those of us who don't use it just to kind of fortune tell or do divination or anything like that, for those of us who are using it in a very kind of self-exploratory kind of way, that we're really just using it to kind of delve into a situation at hand and into our feelings around something and so on. I think we really are using it in a sort of similar way to the way that other people in kind of traditional religious contexts use sacred texts. We are turning to tarot kind of to ask questions and receive answers, but more to kind of explore the question at hand, more to kind of explore the situation that we're in, and specifically to explore it in a very kind of spiritual context, in the context of our spiritual beliefs, and in a way that is going to resonate and vibe with our spiritual selves, right? Because if we're looking for a very kind of mundane answer to a question, some people for sure might turn to the tarot for very kind of mundane reasons, but for me anyway, and I know for many of you, I'm not going to turn to tarot if I have a very kind of mundane question, if I'm just like wondering something about the future or about something that I should do. If it's very kind of practical and mundane, tarot isn't going to be the place that I'm going to go. Tarot is a place I'm going to go if I feel like I have a question at hand that requires me to be very introspective and potentially also kind of remind myself of my spiritual beliefs and ethics and my kind of spiritual worldview, and kind of bring the whole kind of situation into a clearer light, but in that very kind of, in a way that is spiritually centered for me. And I definitely want to maybe look at tarot in this way going forward and start thinking about how I can think of it as being a sacred text in that way, and think about it as a way not only for me to kind of mine my own unconscious and my own experiences and my own kind of, you know, the real truth of what's going on inside me, but also as a way of connecting to, you know, divine cosmos. That's definitely something that I'm interested in trying to think about going forward. But I'm also feeling like I actually want to try and have and find and decide on, or maybe I'll go through many different of them, but I really also want to try and think about and experiment with using a particular book as a sacred text, because tarot is great in that it's not written out for you, right? It's not like, usually not, unless you're using like the little white book or whatever to kind of give you literal kind of like paragraphs of answers of like each card that you've drawn. And that can be a way that you use tarot, and in that way like you could use your kind of interpretative book on your tarot as being a kind of sacred text in that way. But most often we're kind of putting our own interpretations on the cards, and we're very much encouraged to do so. So it's very much from our own intuition more than tapping into another person's intuition. So what I'm interested in doing here is looking at another text, because like I say, it's got that kind of, to me, very sacred aspect of gleaning inspiration and insight from another mind, from another person who has had different experiences to me, and so can offer me a different perspective. So I'm really wondering about this. I'm really trying to think about, do I want to try and look for a non-fiction book? Like, I'm looking over at the books over on the right hand side on my table that I can kind of consider to be my go-to spiritual texts, and I will go through a couple of them in a minute, and I'm wondering if one of them might be a good choice. But I'm also thinking about fiction. I would really like to try this with fiction. Harry Potter to me doesn't seem like the right place to go, because it is so overtly magical already, and it's this very kind of closed world, and it has very specific kind of understandings of how the world works and a very specific kind of morality to it that doesn't necessarily totally mesh with mine. I think it's a little bit too overt in that way. For me, I want something that is maybe a little bit more symbolic, a little bit more metaphorical, something that is speaking more to the human experience, and that is going to take a little bit more effort to maybe read something overtly spiritual out of it. So I'm thinking maybe more like a text, well, I don't know, maybe something that is in the magical realism realm. Like, I'm thinking like something like Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials series obviously would be a great place to go in order to consider like whatever your theology is. Again, it definitely speaks directly to particular theologies. Like, it definitely has its own, it's definitely kind of speaking its own theology. Like, it definitely has a take on the world that is fairly overt. But you could definitely play with that. That would definitely be like a very interesting place to go to seek that kind of interaction. And I'm thinking like maybe other things like American Gods might be another interesting book to look at in this regard, and that's one of my favorite books. It's maybe a little bit less on the theological kind of moralistic side, but it definitely has a particular understanding of what deities are, for example. Still would be an interesting one. But I'm thinking about what it might be like to use a very kind of strict realism novel in this way, and to try and glean something spiritual in something that is not supposed to be spiritual or not supposed to be magical, to try and read kind of spiritual answers out of something that wasn't actually meant to be written in that way. So yeah, I'm definitely going to think about this and think about some of my favorite books over time. I definitely have some novels that I have returned to again and again, and that are kind of favorite books of mine, and I would be interested to maybe try rereading them with this in mind, and specifically with it in mind that I want to pick a book that I'm not just going to read or reread once in a kind of, let's see what I can get out of this spiritually kind of exercise. I want something that I'm going to be able to return to again and again over time and build up more and more associations with it. I don't know how that might work, but I want something that's going to be quite meaty and that's going to have a lot to it. So it's really going to be quite tricky to pull that off. And very briefly, I might just list all of the books in this video. I know I was asked in a different video, on the video in which I first mentioned these books that I left out that were supposed to be part of my morning routine. Somebody asked me if I could list the books in the description. I think I forgot to go back and do that, but I will list all of the books that I have on the side here in the down bar. One or two of them I have brought back to Dublin already, so they're not all there. The ones that I kind of picked out as being the ones that I felt were the most inspirational to me at this moment in time. So it's not a complete list, but some of the books that I turn to the most in terms of like spiritual inspiration are The Universe Story. I've definitely talked about this one before in a video I made that was called, I think, 5 Books That Inspired Me Spiritually, something like that. I'll link that if I remember somewhere up above or down below. I'm pretty sure this was one of the ones that made it into it. This is a really great one. It's very much like kind of popular science, but with a kind of theological kind of slant to it. It's kind of telling the story of the universe in a way that is supposed to be kind of spiritual, or as a kind of an alternative to a religious cosmology, if that makes sense. So it's trying to encourage people to look at a scientific story of the universe, just from a different kind of lens, from a lens of seeing it as a sacred kind of story. And this is one that I like to pick up a lot, just because it's telling the story of the universe, of the development of the universe and human life and humans as well, in a way that is just a little bit different to the way that these kind of scientific theories get put across mostly. So I just find that very inspirational. Another book I have is poetry. I do have several collections of poetry in this section. Mary Oliver is one of my favourite poets in terms of poetry that just speaks to me spiritually. I have several poems of hers that I read at various different points in the Wheel of the Year that I consider to be my kind of prayer for that time of the Wheel of the Year. And she's just a wonderful poet that I like to reach for a lot. I also do reach for Rilke, but I might make a separate video. You know what? Yeah, I'm going to make a separate video on him at some point, because there's a book back in Ireland that I bought for my dad, but that I pick up and read a lot, that is one of my favourite poetry books in terms of like spiritual inspiration. So I'll list that in the down bar as well, in case you want to check that out. Women Who Run with the Wolves. This one, I feel like there's a lot of gender essentialism running through this book. It's kind of based on a premise that is gender essentialist. So if that bothers you, it's probably not going to be for you, but I just will take it all with a pinch of salt. And I still just find this very, very inspiring. It inspires me to pick back up my kind of creative endeavours, like painting and poetry and creative writing and so on. And it also just, reminds me to just look at the world with a kind of slightly different perspective, like with a more kind of magical interpretation of reality and that kind of thing, and to really kind of value my intuition, to value my dream world, to value my imagination and the psychic realm and all of that kind of thing. So that's just a really, really good one for that. PaGaian Cosmology is a classic. Again, it's just one that was the book that started me on my most recent path of my spiritual endeavours. I definitely went through a kind of Wiccan pagan phase in my teenage years, but in my 20s, when I was kind of discovering pantheism and rediscovering my spirituality, PaGaian Cosmology, it's very Starhawk inspired, which is another book that I grabbed there. I love Starhawk. She's probably my favourite of the classic kind of pagan authors, pagan witchcraft, Wicca-ish authors. PaGaian Cosmology is, I would say, very, very Starhawk inspired, but she's also been inspired by the Universe Story, which is the first book that I mentioned. It's quite scientific plus kind of Wicca-ish paganism, which is just a wonderful combination for me, and kind of understanding, like, she kind of is interpreting those metaphors that are used in the pagan kind of sphere, such as the Wheel of the Year and the Triple Goddess and things like that. She's understanding them through a kind of scientific lens and associating the Triple Goddess with natural processes and stuff that we have understood in other ways through a scientific lens. So it reminds me of the importance of like expressing and celebrating things that we know scientifically through symbolic spiritual celebrations, and the importance of that for us psychically, and how we can just tap into that in a much more exciting and satisfying way spiritually, rather than just through reading it through kind of a very scientific lens. So those are the ones I grabbed. There are a couple more over there as well, and like I say, there were a few more that went back home to Ireland already, but I would feel like some of these texts are definitely, all of these are sacred texts to me. These are the ones that have been the most inspirational to me in the past kind of 5 to 10 years on my spiritual path. But I feel like if I'm looking for, like I say, if I'm looking for a special sacred text that is going to be something that I will come back to again and again and try and keep reading into it and reading my spirituality into it and exploring my spirituality through it, and especially kind of exploring my current situation in life through a spiritual lens, I think I'm going to need something that is a little bit less overt, that is a little bit more kind of left field, that is going to kind of take me in it through a kind of a more imaginative route towards the spiritual questions that I have and so on. So yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Do you have a sacred text or sacred texts, and how do you feel about that? And do Do you want one? Do you miss one if you used to have one? Like if you used to have a relationship with the Bible or the Quran or the Torah or any other sacred text? Yeah, do you miss that? Do you want that back in your life? Yeah, what are your thoughts? Or do you think it's necessary? Do you think it's possible? Or do you think of tarot as kind of being a sacred text? Because I think that's an interesting one as well, and definitely something that I'm going to think about more going forward. So yeah, thanks for watching as always, and do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will talk to you again soon.